suddenly the idea popped up that we need a similar exercise here in Balkans in order to be able to put ourselves on the map of global debate regarding security issues, but also to make sure that people will come to Belgrade from our region and beyond, and in discussing, in making new friendships, in visiting a few different places, manage to maybe understand us better and see what can be done in order to make the Balkans a better, safer, and happier place. I must say that at the very beginning, I am first and foremost very grateful to the two partner organizations of Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence. I'm addressing you on behalf of that one. And the Belgrade Center for Security Policies and the European Movement, because it was a joy and a challenge to work together and to learn day by day that we are able to build partnerships and to endure in partnerships. I'm also grateful, at the very beginning I must say, to our dear colleague, Philippines, because yes, the idea was born jointly to have this big event, but it was Philip who was fully and totally in charge of bringing you people here together and creating a pre-event that is quite different than some other similar ones that I participated in. Usually, these are young people who are invited, and then somehow during the whole proceedings, they are kind of a little bit marginalized and forgotten. At the end, maybe someone mentions that there was an event, parallel or pre-event, with young people. We would like it different. We are expecting you to renew the discourse, to have some challenging ideas, because without ongoing challenges and thinking out of the box, I don't believe that we will be able to, we as humankind, to find solutions that are up to the challenges we are facing these days in this region, in Europe, and in the whole world. I must say this is a great pleasure and honor to be here in front of you. This is also, in a way, for me, the general rehearsal, as I said to my dear friend Bill Infante before tomorrow. Don't take it wrong, general rehearsals are the most important part of every play. So if we do it right today, hopefully we will be as good, maybe even better, tomorrow. But before I give over the floor to our panelists, because this is why we are here for, I would like to thank those without whom this thing would simply not be possible. I want to thank our partners, the Slovak Atlantic Council, supported by the Slovak Aid, and the Balkan Fund for Democracy of German Marshall Fund. I would like to very much thank the support UNDP, NATO, European Fund for the Balkans, as well as the embassies of Kingdom of Norway, United States of America, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. And last but not least, I want to thank Holcim, the company who made sure that tomorrow evening, instead of going to the McDonald's or something like that, we will have a wonderful dinner together. And of course, I want to thank you in the first place of trusting us that we can put an important forum together, being here with us, and I wish you very, very pleasant stay in Belgrade, and first and foremost, an excellent, intellectually rich and exciting conference.
Hello. My name is Zora Popova. I'll be the moderator of this first panel. I'd just like to say that it's my pleasure to have the possibility to open this pre-event of the first Belgrade Security Forum. The panel that you will listen to is called the Security Challenges in the Western Balkans, and there will be 4 presentations within this panel. 2 of the presentations are directly, they address the problems of the consequences of the devastating war that occurred here in the Balkans. And the 2 other papers project these consequences in onto the process of democratization of the Balkan societies in the context of globalization. So, for that reason, to have the more logical development of the topic, there will be a change of the order of the presentation from the one you see here in the booklet. So the first speaker will be Jana Bačević from the with her paper. Thank you. The Conflict and Its Aftermath in South Serbia, Social and Ethnic Relations, Agency belonging in Preševo and Bujanovac. And just to introduce you, to say a few words about Jana Bačević. She's a research associate at the Center for Comparative Conflict Studies at the Faculty of Media Communications and at the Faculty of Political Sciences in the University of Belgrade. And also, since 2010, she is a visiting research fellow at the Central European University in Budapest. So, Jana.
Okay, well, thank you. Right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have a rather challenging task, which is always falls to the first presenter in the morning sessions, which is to keep you awake rather than not let you fall asleep. I hope to be able to do that, mostly because the research that I'm going to present, at least from what I've heard, differs a bit in approach from what is the usual or standard approach to analysis of post-conflict situations and developments. In particular, what I'm going to present today is a study that has been conducted by a team of researchers at the Center for Comparative Conflict Studies at the Faculty of Media and Communications in Belgrade. Orly Friedman, Jelena Tosic, Ian Bancroft, and myself, with the generous aid of a number of students in the MA program in Conflict Studies at the Faculty of Media and Communications. The title of the research report is The Conflict and Its Aftermath in South Serbia, Social and Ethnic Relations, Agency and Belonging in Preševo and Bujanovac. Now, as some of you may know, the short-term low-scale insurgency in Preševo and Bujanovac was ended with the signing of the Concord Peace Agreement in 2001. The conflict itself was frequently described and framed in terms of a spillover effect from Kosovo. However, the post-conflict development was also frequently described as a success story. So this is one of the rare post-conflict situations in the Western Balkans that was described as, by many stakeholders, as a success story. However, the region remains volatile. There is high poverty and high unemployment, very low levels of education, very high levels of emigration as well. Social integration also remains relatively low, and there is military presence in the region, which many of its inhabitants see as a form of security threat. As well, one of the factors that are contributing to the instability of the region of Preševo, Bujanovac, and Medveđa is the indeterminacy of its status. Referring primarily to the on and off calls or discussions, sometimes less, sometimes more formal, of different possibilities, including its secession and or unification with Kosovo, and as well the proposal that I presume some of you might be familiar with, which is to trade the Preševo and Bujanovac for the Serb-domineered north of Kosovo. So all of these factors are contributing to the instability of the region, and this is another reason why there is a significant presence of international development efforts in the region, as well as a lot of local development efforts. In addition, within the state, the framework of the Republic of Serbia, the region has a somewhat special status. It is governed by according to the Čović Plan, which was introduced after the signing of the peace agreement as a form of, rather as a plan for developing stability and peace in the region. And also it is governed by, or rather it is coordinated by a special body within the framework of the Republic of Serbia, the coordination body for Preševo, Bujanovac, and Medveđa. There had been in the recent months especially, there have been different attempts at multicultural governance, so the emphasis on making the local governance in Preševo and Bujanovac multicultural, meaning the sort of local government that will include representatives from more than one ethnic group, is also a sort of specific characteristic in relation to at least Central Serbia. What this study, or rather the study that I will present today, was about, the Center for Comparative Conflict Studies at the Faculty of Media and Communications in Belgrade was commissioned by the UNDP office in Serbia in order to provide a more in-depth understanding of the conflict. What we were informed by when designing this study was the approach pioneered by Johan Galtung, one of the first researchers in the field of conflict studies, which distinguishes between positive and negative peace. Now, negative peace is what we definitely have in Preševo and Bujanovac, meaning that there is no open violence. But on the other hand, negative peace also can imply that there is no real integration. So people are not really living together and getting along well. There's just the absence of violence. So the approach that we took initially was to try and see whether what we have in Preševo and Bujanovac today can be described more in terms of a negative or perhaps also in terms of positive peace. In other words, we wanted to see what is, as experts say, what is really going on the ground, because this is paradoxically something that has not really been tackled in previous research and policy analysis relating to the conflict in the south of Serbia. In that sense, we focused on the perceptions, narratives, and opinions of people living in Preševo and Bujanovac, which also meant that we aimed for a sort of anthropological approach. We aimed to move from the focus, the usual focus on elite interviewing, so talking only to those who are experts about the region, into talking to the social groups normally described as ordinary people. So people from different ethnic groups, different social backgrounds, who regularly on a daily basis experience the life in Preševo and Bujanovac, and see what do they think about issues such as quality of life, peace and security, inter-ethnic and inter-group relations, so relations between different ethnic groups, but also relations between different social groups, which is, again, one of the dimensions that tends to be overlooked when it comes to post-conflict analysis in the Western Balkans, as a matter of course. And, of course, the relationship with authorities, meaning both the central government in Belgrade and different other authorities that can sometimes exert power over the region. The methodology of the research itself comprised an extensive background research, including a literature review and the acquisition and comparison of demographic data, combined with field work that focused on in-depth interviews and participant observation. What we focused on in the analysis were the categories that participants, so the population of Preševo and Bujanovac, uses. The definition of categories was based on an analytical perspective in the social sciences known as grounded theory, and should you be interested in it, I will be more than happy to elaborate on it in the Q&A, but I will not do so now. Which basically means that the chief categories we looked at were agency. So what do actors, what do people living there feel they can and cannot do, which is also very important. Belonging, where do they feel they belong? So in relation to which identities they position themselves, including in relation to which geographical and political entities They define their own existence and agency. And of course, the state, which is usually a shorthand in narratives. This tends to be a shorthand for any sort of authority, and others. So who are the representatives, the members of other groups, so people who are not we, in order to, of course, see what are these categories that dominate the way of thinking, the reflection on the daily life in Preševo and Bujanovac. Briefly, the results of our analysis. Of course, Preševo and Bujanovac are a very diverse region, and so all of these things cannot really be taken at face value. So these are, of course, generalizations, and once our report comes out, you'll be able to see different variations between social groups in relation to this. But what remains as the general characteristics of the analyzed sample? There is an overwhelming feeling of marginality or marginalization, even pluri-marginalization, meaning different aspects, rather marginalization in relation to different aspects of the region and of its inhabitants. So they feel marginalized both in relation to the central government in Belgrade, in relation to Kosovo. They feel that they are stuck between what they term as political proxies, Belgrade and Pristina, but also in the regional and, of course, even more so in the European context, especially when they engage in illegal emigration. So they feel marginalized in other European countries. There is deep-seated mistrust and ethnic divisions that significantly, according to our results, and contrary to what is normally assumed, they significantly predate the conflict in 2001. So in common people talk, the different ethnic and social groups in Preševo and Bujanovac were not really getting along very well even before the conflict erupted. And in that sense, the conflict was a sort of a glazing over of the divisions that were there long time ago. Perhaps not surprisingly in relation to this last conclusion, the conflict is by the population of Preševo and Bujanovac often perceived as external or as imposed. And the interethnic relations in the region are described as basically peaceful but non-existent. So what they say is that, well, there is no violence, but we're not really living together, which goes back to the distinction between, on the one hand, negative and, on the other hand, positive peace established by Jochen Galtung, which I said was the entry point of our research team into this study. In that sense, different attempts, both by the government of Serbia and by a number of international organizations, to stimulate different levels of multicultural governance or interaction between different ethnicities and cultures are sometimes perceived as artificial or imposed. So what the majority of the participants say is that there's this feeling of imposed someone is forcing them to be multicultural, but that's not a real thing. Another quite relevant result is that self-agency, so as I said, what the participants feel they can do, both in relation to their own lives and in relation to the quality of life in the region, is perceived as very limited. So, and it's highly dependent on external forces. Sometimes in psychology this is described as fatalism. I wouldn't go as far as that, among other things, because the environment in Preševo and Bujanovac is really not conducive to a lot of personal agency. But all in all, the participants in the research really felt that their agency is significantly constrained by external factors, primarily, as I had already said, the two political proxies of different entities in the region, mainly Belgrade and Pristina. Similarly, and again, not entirely surprisingly, there is a somewhat ambiguous relationship towards the state authorities, combining both high expectations and very low levels of trust. This is in particular more prominent among Albanian participants in the study, but the part about high expectations tends to be relatively regularly distributed across different ethnic and social groups. Finally, the international development efforts, because we also focused on the impact and perception of the international development projects in the region, were mostly appreciated when they were tangible or visible. So that means mostly investments in infrastructure, building schools, roads, etc. And were only, participants mostly needed prompting to say, or rather in order to reflect on these, so to speak, higher level consequences or impacts of international peace building and development efforts. So all in all, they needed some sort of, it was the tangible results that were appreciated most, which again is not perhaps that surprising. In conclusion, now we're shifting the level of discourse a bit towards what all these things might mean. So what are the implications? The indeterminacy of status, or rather frequent bringing up of different solutions for the region, makes the region appear as being stuck between Belgrade and Pristina, and again, not entirely surprisingly, somewhat lowers the incentives of local actors towards reconciliation and work on the development of the region. Low economic development and the scarcity of the resources contribute to the perception of ethnic politics as a zero-sum game, meaning that there is very obvious ethnic retrenchment or entrenchment of local politicians, and all gains for one side, meaning for one ethnic political side, are automatically perceived as losses for the other. Apparently, the grouping of actors and political agendas then aids to the reproduction of ethnic divisions, again in the same vein. So politics is defined mostly in ethnic terms, so it's mostly ethnic politics, and all advantages gained by one ethnic party are automatically disadvantages for the other ethnic party, which obviously, I presume I don't have to elaborate on this, does not really aid reconciliation or development in the region. Now, the final, or perhaps the most staggering or challenging conclusion that we aim to put forward is that most of international as well as local development efforts actually incentivize ethnic affiliation. So people in the region are rewarded for being Serb or Albanian or Roma, and they're rewarded for putting forward projects that aim to somehow improve the conditions of life of Serbs, Albanians, or Roma. A relatively small proportion of projects in the region focuses on the region as such, or on the lives of Preševljani and Bujanovčani as such. And this sort of approach can actually contribute to the reproduction of ethnic divisions. Of course, it's not the only factor, and it would be rather unwise to assume it is the most significant factor, but I think that it's relatively important to underline that this can also basically have an effect adverse from what is probably intended in the first place. By this, I thank you for your attention, and of course I'll be more than happy to answer any questions or hear any comments in the discussion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jana. Yes, so the questions, if you have questions to pose to Jana, please write them down if you are afraid that you will forget them while listening to the other panelists, because we will hear first the other three panelists, and then we'll have the session with the questions and answers. So the next person to present their paper is Marius Kalu from Queen Mary University of London. He's a PhD candidate there in political sciences, and he's working on the topic of his research is beyond the liberal peace building, the role of the EU in Kosovo and the questions of sovereignty. So now the presentation he will give to you is about is entitled "What Makes Kosovo a Weak State."
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Okay. So the title of the presentation is "What Makes Kosovo a Weak State: A Dual Focus Between Liberal Interventionism and the Legacy of the Past." It's very good that we had the first presentation because I'm going to take all those empirical findings to a more theoretical level. So these are the two hypotheses I present in this paper, and the first one looks at why state building objectives fail. Mainly the objective of establishing domestic sovereignty, and this is mainly because there is a perpetual state-society rift. Therefore, failing to meet the requirements of legitimate and sustainable domestic sovereignty indicates a continuous situation of state weakness. From a more simple equation, this can be presented as a perpetual state-society rift derives the peril of permanent state weakness. The second hypothesis derives from the question, what cultivates state-society fracture, and affirms that the source is not only the influence of external administration, thus external legitimacy, but also and perhaps mainly the contestation and substitution of state authority by non-state formations, what I call sub-state authorities. For this purpose, I present in my paper the key ideas of the critique of liberal interventionism that focuses on the role of suprastate international administration and the failure of liberal peace building in comparison with an alternative approach, a growing literature that puts emphasis on endogenous factors such as the legacy of the past as the perennial source of state weakness. I obviously had to define state weakness in the beginning, and but I essentially look at what are the political goods and how the state whether has the will and capacity to provide this. State weakness can thus be defined as the lack of capacity or will to provide some of the fundamental goods associated with security and stability. This can refer to developing rule of law, developing legitimate institutions, economic management, social welfare, and such. We can thus, with this criteria, we can categorize states into weak, failing, collapsed, or strong, as we all wish to say. In relation to the idea of domestic sovereignty, which is important for my overall thesis, a state must be able to govern and exercise its powers and use its resources for the benefit of its people. From this angle, we can thus highlight the importance of a good relationship between the state and its society. The first part of the paper thus focuses on exogenous explanations and presents the main idea of the critique of liberal peace building, so as to highlight the changing character of sovereignty in a post-colonial and post-communist context. Contesting state authority, thus the outside dependency is the main argument of criticizing liberal peace building. My paper evaluates the literature that highlights the impact of external factors as the cause of weakness. Firstly, by looking at the changing character of sovereignty as exemplified by post-colonial context of quasi-states. These quasi-states are new states in ex-colonies that had no sense of nationhood and had been dependent on external administration, which was actually continued in the post-independence period, mainly because in Stephen Krasner's words, we only had a change in international legal sovereignty. The states gained international legal sovereignty, but they never gained domestic sovereignty and capacity to provide political goods. And in this context, sovereignty could only be guaranteed from outside by external administration, as political authority could not be derived from a collective consciousness. The legacy of the past was thus very important, and this is similar in a post-communist society where the contested authority of the state continued, and we had a huge skepticism and distrust in state authority. By looking at some of the key characteristics of Kosovo, we can now shift our attention to endogenous factors of state weakness. In post-1990, in Kosovo, we had very interesting developments such as the idea of a parallel state and the main role of the Kosovo Liberation Army, which seemed to simulate for a long time a real state authority. Without getting into detail, what's important for me is to look at the impact of these issues and how these issues were ignored by external administration, and with this ignorance they were actually reinforcing state weakness and made state weakness sustainable by these sub-state formations. In the post-war period, the contest for political authority was adjudicated by the Kosovo Albanians, and this created a liberal peace-building framework that collapsed into a Kosovo Albanian project of statehood, rather than a liberal one, as we had been used to it before. The necessary democratic link between the state and society and the creation of civil society were in this context instantly undermined by the external top-down control of international administration, but at the same time a perennial state weakness was installed under the co-influence of unofficial non-state authority formations. What appears to have emerged is that the development of a civil society was monopolized by foreign internationals and exploited by local entrepreneurs. The concern about sub-state forms of authority reaches beyond the peril of legitimating warring groups that can provide security of local population more efficiently than state authorities. More precisely, in a context where state builders have actually started to develop effective forms of central authority capable of ensuring law and order, a more complex problem arises. These new forms of central authority represent the state only in theory, while in practice they embody the legacy of non-state forms of authority. The sub-state relations of authority are now transferred in the public realm of politics and simulate the centralized character of domestic sovereignty. In the analysis of state building and state weakness, the element where these two broad theoretical perspectives intersect is the legitimacy of the political authority and the impact of the society-state fracture. This intersection of arguments indicates the role of non-state actors in keeping political authority away from the state. I will quote Migdal, who says that both forces originating outside the boundaries that the state claims for itself and those within its borders have contested state efforts to monopolize the exercising of authority. The result has thus been the limited state. In the context of liberal state-building framework, the problems of identifying collective will, implementing popular democracy, or developing sovereignty are related to the causes behind the absence of the state-society interdependence. Thus, my aim to focus on endogenous characteristic of state weakness in an ex-communist context. Very interesting to see how the state-society relationship has developed after the end of communism, and also in the context of the conflict. The focus should be more on problems of the past, such as paternalism, subjugation, and the passive acceptance of the regime. But at the same time, on the very sensitive topic of how during communism there was an institutionalized ethnicity and nationalism. So another key legacy of communist regime was thus related to institutionalizing ethnicity and nationalism out of practical socio-economic interest. Post-communist post-communist nationalism was influenced by the measure taken by the communist state to reinforce national identities and to institutionalize nationhood. In Yugoslavia, these state policies had gradually created proto-states by favoring federal units defined by a majority national group. Ethnic division has determined a self-centered notion of national identity, constructed around the quest for national control of the contested homeland. In the Western Balkans, as a result of ethnic nationalism, making an economic privilege out of political loyalty, the decimation of the middle class and the state reluctance to confront the past, societies have emerged as deeply fragmented along the lines of ethnicity, welfare, and ideology. Another potential problem in a post-conflict multi-ethnic society is that of developing ethnic sovereignty. Let us remember that peace building includes the phases of stopping a conflict and that of trying to maintain peace. In the aftermath of the ethnic conflict, there is a possibility of establishing a political context favorable for the victim side. In other words, one ethnicity can be overprotected and given the attribute of who is local in the eyes of the international administration. Furthermore, ethnic nationalism gained legitimacy in Southeastern Europe and the ex-Soviet Union space, not only as a form of opposition to communism, but also as a credible threat to the national state per se. Political division determined by unsettled historical problems, political and economic conflict generated by reforms and international legitimation of the process of self-determination are all factors that have fortified reciprocally and have contributed to the escalation of ethnic conflicts in Yugoslavia. The obvious danger has been to reiterate socio-ethnic segregation and even institutionalized ethnic sovereignty. In the context of post-war Kosovo, the state-building efforts to develop local autonomy has permitted the Albanians to define themselves as the new locals after evolving as a counterforce to the Serbian authority before 1999. The liberal democratic project to implement the standards before status strategy in Kosovo has automatically favored an ethnic-based sovereignty by neglecting the particular issues of post-conflict, post-communist, and ethnically divided society. Core liberal values such as pluralism were at stake from the start and continues to be a key challenge for the development of a state with democratic legal authority in Kosovo. Moreover, the resulting local ownership that the international administration encouraged is ethnicized and not in accordance with liberal norms of popular sovereignty. I introduced this code from Richmond and Franks to highlight that even though state mechanisms are in place, they may not function because of the pre-established illiberal non-state notions of authority rooted in ethnic, national, economic, and religious ties. In conclusion, I must say that Kosovo is a weak state, but is not failed and is not a failing state either. This is mainly because state authority works to a certain extent. Political goods are provided to a certain extent, but the international administrators are neglecting the fact that this is done mainly by a sub-state form of authority based on a sub-state legitimacy. Secondly, the legacy of the past has a very deep impact on the state-building efforts that have been going on in Kosovo. And again, what I want to highlight is how by neglecting these endogenous elements, state building has led to reinforcing sub-state actors that simulate legitimate state authority and are capable of prolonging a weak and minimum but sustainable provision of some political goods. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marius. So the next speaker is Lieutenant Colonel Metodi Hadjiyanev. He has spent almost 12 years of service as Special Force officer in Macedonian Special Forces. And in 2003, he was deployed as a commander of the Macedonian Special Task Forces in Iraq. Since 2011, Metodi Hajianev has been assigned as head of Social Science Department at the Military Academy in Skopje and co-director of Intelligence Sharing Course in NATO Center for Excellence Defense Against Terrorism in Ankara, Turkey. The paper, the presentation he will give before you is entitled Security Challenges to the Critical Infrastructure in the Western Balkans and the Case of Macedonia.
Dobar dan, Beograde. Okay, my presentation is kind of actually in continuation of what we have discussed now, but I rather take a different position and highlight different challenges to the security that comes to the Western Balkans, which is actually a global phenomenon rising from the non-state actors. My agenda is I will shortly describe how global security after the Cold War has changed and how that has actually affected all the national securities around the world, especially Western Balkans. And then I will specifically talk about the threats to the critical infrastructure protection in the Western Balkans. I will address two issues that I find as more relevant to this issue, and then I will shortly address the necessity of appropriate strategy for a critical infrastructure protection, and then try to propose some solution and the way ahead. The end of the Cold War has actually changed the security environment around the world and around the globe, and has dramatically affected not just the whole world, but Western Balkans specifically. The globalization and the innovation in technology and communication has actually opened space for new actors. Those actors were not so much on the scene before the Cold War. So the media, NGOs, other groups, actually non-state actors came into the scene. All of those actors are interlinked, interconnected, and they actually they are pursuing to maximize their position around the globe, and actually they struggle for it. The pursuit to achieve their goals has actually increased the flow of capital, goods and services. Actually they helped, and the pursuit to actually achieve their goals has helped to flatten the world. So the Friedman said the world became flat. However, the flat did not mean smooth. The post-conflict process, post-conflict management in former Yugoslavia ran through democratization, actually misunderstood the complex environment. So the lack of experience in privatization and democratization actually after Cold War has challenged Western Balkan securities for several reasons. There was a corruption, a huge corruption, and soon democracy was interrupted as demagogy. At the same time, private sector emerged as one of the key, crucial element of the new society. However, it wasn't managed appropriately. Let's say there were a lot of private security companies that came on the scene. However, the place that they replaced from the former national security, it wasn't managed appropriately. So soon private security wasn't nested appropriately into the national securities. This shift in international world order did not avoid issues that were already present in the Middle East too. Globalization has affected Middle East with all of its effects. So soon many people in the Middle East have started to look into the issues or the attempts of globalization as attack of their Eastern values. So soon they believe that this is Western cultural imperialism that try to attack their traditional values and try to oppose that. The unidirectional top-down character of globalization has affected dramatically all regions and soon became a problem by itself. It started to be seen as a problem by itself. So on the one hand, there was profit and there was prosperity that was coming alongside with the globalization. However, on the other hand, there was a new environment that actually gave such incredible power to the non-state actors that they soon attempted to threaten many national securities around the world in pursuit to achieving their goals. Changing in the international actually security point came to the and this changes actually on the international world arena has affected Western Balkans for two reasons. The first one is the threats from the terrorist attack that actually came on the scene, especially after 9/11. And the second one is due to the active involvement in the so-called global war on terror by many Western Balkans countries. And I will address all of these threats and try to elaborate them in specifics. I will first address the threats to the critical infrastructure protection in the Western Balkans from potential terrorist attacks. Well, fundamental groups, individuals and groups that are linked to Al-Qaeda, also known as Al-Qaeda and its associated movement, employ terrorist attacks that are critically infrastructure focused. They actually realized that in order to bring more fatality and to bring actually more casualty, they should attack critical infrastructures that at the same time were not managed to appropriately concern the security threats, because I will explain that later. The architects were highly oriented in the profit and actually they didn't match the security components while they were building this infrastructure. The argument that Al-Qaeda and its associated movement actually are, and the attacks are critical infrastructure focused, are attested during past attacks like in Mumbai, then Madrid, London, and Moscow recently in 2010. All of those attacks actually are on critical infrastructure, and they brought high-level fatalities. The reason, as I mentioned, was the profit concerns and cost reduction and efficiency because of the architects and owners of this infrastructure. Therefore, the growing dependence on this actually network had not been matched properly by the security concerns. Another reason why this came into the scene was because after the Cold War and when the world became flat, the impact of media and the impact of human life and how to say elevation of the human life actually became far more important than in the past. So actually the pressure that came with the number of fatality to the political elites was another reason. As you can see, Spain, for example, withdrew from Iraq, supporting global war on terror just because attack on Madrid. So this actually tests the power that those non-state actors have and possess. Because, I mean, can you imagine the country today that can attack London or Madrid or New York or DC as they did? No one can do that on a regular basis conventionally. So basically, another reason is that the evidence of Western Balkans countries in individuals connected to these groups actually also raises serious concerns to the Western Balkan security. And for example, a 2003 Defense and Foreign Affairs report claims that Hussein Zivali, former Bosnian ambassador to the United Nations, has connection with the 9/11 attacks. Another connection is Bosnian ties to the 2004 Madrid train bombing and failed attempt to the funeral pubs, attack on pub's funeral by Bosnian-based radicals in April 2005, or the one, Bosnian-based radicals in April 2005, or arrest of a Kosovo Albanian connection with the London terror attack and London terror plots, and the Bosnian youth's arrest in November, late in November this year, or arrest of a 21 years old Kosovo Albanian origin in Frankfurt attacked this year, or maybe other connections that were also outside, as the list of beliefs attest that the Western intervention simultaneously with foreign Islamic proceduralizing and funding have highlighted the risk of Balkans security. Those are only a few that I have popped out from the open sources, and trust me, if you go to the security and classified information, there are far more evidence of these connections. Furthermore, Al-Qaeda and its associated movement in Western Balkans have adopted and became sufficient in using technology. So there is also another connection to the Bosnian groups that actually they have used internet and trying to hooked on what have became modern threat by those groups to use internet and connect people that have never actually met in their life. So they are using that and using the opportunity and fulfill what most of the Western experts call a self-radicalized terrorist. The Sarajevo arrest of late 2005 actually drew attention of this type of groups that they came together, and even they don't know each other, they can come in connection and have and plan the attacks. I have highlighted those. Those are the open sources that you can find the arguments about this fact. So global trends toward economic and energy efficiency is another problem that actually brings or rises the security challenge to the Western Balkan security, because I mean, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. I'm saying that the pursuit to global energy efficiency from the Balkan countries, which is highly actually supported by also Western countries and represented as one of the important things towards the accepting free market and open market, raises other concerns. Why? Because as the Euro-Atlantic integration fall more into the grip to the international corporates and energy efficiency, like those, let's say, in Bulgaria, Greece, Albania, Macedonia, that try to build pipelines across the region, actually gives more opportunity to those groups. I'm not saying that we should not going to build this or we should stop building this. I'm saying that this actually means more opportunity for those groups, because as I mentioned before, none of this has matched actually security factor and security concerns. While the goal of energy corridor development may be positive, actually the problem came with the fact that more pipelines simply means more tangible territory for Al-Qaeda and its associated movements. So it's true that actually all Western Balkan security agencies have agreed that Al-Qaeda and associated movements has significant and unique presence in the region of Western Balkans. Although some experts believe that this presence is highly limited, there are also other experts and respected academics who believe that this should not be neglected, this presence should not be neglected. As I mentioned, another reason for this type of threats is presence in the global war on terror by most of the Western Balkan countries. Republic of Macedonia and other Western Balkan countries, some of them still haven't actually connected to the global war on terror. Also jump into something that actually brought a lot of issues. Global war on terror challenges, I'm not going to go in specifics, I'm just going to highlight them. Act of war, approaching to terrorism as an act of war, which actually caused deviation and a lot of issues inside alliance even more. Europeans did not agree with the US and UK approach that to terrorism you should approach as an act of war. Then self-defense, preemption and detention that actually caused a lot of issues. This actually brought a problem especially after this operation, which is highly now cited, because after this operation, the Al-Qaeda physically was destroyed. After that, the new Al-Qaeda was actually created as it is now. It has one cell and it's a type of a hydra. It's not a structure of a pyramid or something which classical terrorists have. And this actually creates the problem to the Western Balkans, and this is the reason why they have they bring such a threat to the Western Balkan security. Republic of Macedonia and many other Western Balkan countries, as I mentioned, are part of this war, global war on terror, which actually brings a lot of problem, because all of the alliances are targets to these violent non-state actors. So necessity of appropriate strategy for critical infrastructure protection facing the new security. Many countries actually don't have a real strategy for critical infrastructure protection, and this strategy should actually focus on centralized planning and decentralized execution. Many academics around the world also recognize this phenomenon and believe that there is a need of effective strategy. Macedonia, like many of the Western Balkan countries, doesn't have critical infrastructure protection strategy. We have, however, crisis management, and many Western Balkan countries have. However, none of them have specifically a strategy or part of the strategy that will concern the issues regarding the critical infrastructure protection. NATO-based approach is maybe best way, which actually focuses on having a list of critical infrastructure that will be signed by all the agencies. And however, one should be very careful when take this for granted, because the defaults might be helpful, but they should be adjusted to the specific regions and specific cultures. Macedonia, like I said, have quite good of networks of institutions that could actually serve as a good background, or also legally Macedonia have quite good background, and we have quite good background for critical infrastructure protection. However, the problem with this is that this is not properly managed. The one thing, as I said, Macedonia is missing is centralized planning and decentralized execution. And this is actually the problem for the many Western Balkan countries, because the centralized planning tradition is actually in our nature. However, we don't have decentralized execution. And other problem with this is that many of the Western Balkan countries didn't actually incorporate private corporate security into the critical infrastructure protection. This is very important because the modus operandi of terrorists, of new terrorists, don't actually care, doesn't care of the mistakes that governments will make, and the complex system analysis of their behavior also represents that they will attack where we least expect them at least. The way ahead, as I say, is that this is not an isolated area. It should not really look as isolated area. So I'm not suggesting that we should go and seek for a specific different structure, but this should be actually incorporated into the overall strategy. The Western Balkans need a number of cross-institutional bodies that will look into these issues, and they will actually manage in a centralized way. In terms of coordination, this recent practice shows that many governments around the world have established cross-sector advisory boards. However, this should be also put in practice, and I will now come into the conclusion that which is the process of globalization has brought positive and negative effects to the global security. The process of transition, democratization, inexperience in accepting new values, and participation in the global war on terror by the Western Balkan countries actually affected their security. Macedonia and all Western Balkan countries do not have defined strategy for critical infrastructure protection. And although Macedonia, like many of the Western Balkan countries, have quite good networks of institutional bodies, it's still needed to go ahead and have focus more on centralized planning, decentralized execution, and put all of this in practice. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the final speaker is Dr. Katarina Gaczewska. She is a lecturer in criminology and security studies and a member of the Center of Applied Criminology at Birmingham City University. And she has researched and published in the area of democracy and fighting organized crime. The paper she will present today is Fighting Organized Crime, Social or Security Policy, the Lessons Learned from Bulgaria.
I figure I have about 1 minute left to present. I actually don't have a PowerPoint presentation, and this is the first time I present without a PowerPoint, so it's going to be perhaps a bit challenging or perhaps useful, because I may actually focus on what I have to say better. I will try to limit the presentations. I'll try to be less than 15 minutes so we can have more time for discussion. But basically, what I would want to talk about is the key aspects of my research and the key aspects of the paper and the kind of structure around which I'm trying to kind of develop this argument that I'm going to present to you. So because I come from criminology as well as security studies disciplines, my paper is a little bit a mixture of both. So I am on one part looking at the fight against organized crime, which is a challenge in all of the Balkan states today, as well as the whole world, because all states, as we know, have been engaged in one way or another in this kind of way of dealing with the crime problem internally as well as internationally. But I'm also looking at the issue of crime from a traditional sociological, criminological perspective, as something which is, has conditions, social conditions that are embedded in the social structure, and not just a security issue as such. What I looked at in the case of organized crime is the way that fight against organized crime has developed in Bulgaria, and the way whether the fight against organized crime actually strengthened the state, strengthened democracy, or did it lead to any kind of unexpected outcomes. And as you may know about the case of Bulgaria or other states in the Balkans, the fight against organized crime has not at all actually been successful, and all of those states are still considering organized crime as one of the issues that on the top of their agenda. There are 5 basically key things that I structure the paper around. First of all, the rise of organized crime as a security threat. Why was it that in the 1990s organized crime became such an important issue in the European Union and the Balkans and the case of Bulgaria in particular? I don't necessarily explain this with the rise of crime as such, because of the rise of organized crime, I don't think organized crime is a new phenomenon. Actually, if you look back in history, you may link crime to piracy, you may link crime to international conflict, you may link crime to the opium wars of the 19th century, the smuggling of opium in China, and so on and so on. So there's many aspects of, or even in the Balkans, the bandits during the Ottoman Empire, the kind of liberation movement linked to smuggling as well, and the issues of organized crime. So organized crime as such is not a new phenomenon. However, it became very prominent in the 1990s, and it was interestingly linked to state building or state rebuilding as such in the Southeastern Europe and in the case of Bulgaria. So I think that partly the reason why organized crime became such a big issue in the Balkans was obviously the external factors and the pressure that came from the European Union. And I have a quote from the European Security Strategy here, which exemplifies that prioritization of organized crime. According to the European Security Strategy adopted in 2003, organized crime is an internal threat to our security that has an important external dimension to the European Union. Cross-border trafficking in drugs, women, illegal migrants, and weapons accounts for a large part of the activities of organized crime. It can have links to terrorism. Such criminal activities are often associated with weak or failing states. Taking these different elements together, terrorism committed to maximum violence, the availability of weapons of mass destruction, organized crime, the weakening of the state system, and the privatization of force, we could be confronted with a very radical threat indeed. So the implications of this security strategy is that organized crime is actually contributing to the weakening of the state. It is a cause rather than an effect of the weakening of the state, which is something peculiar in that argument. What I actually looked at in my research is the opposite cause-effect connection, whereby the increased focusing on organized crime as an issue connected with the restructuring of the state, the changes that have happened in the 1990s in terms of neoliberal policies, privatization, kind of shrinking of the state, removal of the state from a lot of the traditional social functions that developed since the Second World War, during communism as well as Western Europe, has actually contributed to the rise of crime rather than the other way around. So this is the first aspect that I look at, whether organized crime is kind of contributing to the weakening of the state, or whether it's a result of that weakening of the state. And actually the argument is very peculiar, because these two things seem to be interconnected in a much more complex way. What happened in the 1990s in Bulgaria, what was peculiar, is this linking of organized crime to the reform agenda of the neoliberal reform agenda of the liberal parties in Bulgaria, and particularly the government of Kostov, which came into power in 1997. I think it is an interesting development. So apart from the external factors and the pressure from the European Union internally, the fight against organized crime, the issue of organized crime became highly politicized because it was linked, it was connected with the old elites. There was a development of a rhetoric that unless we get rid of the old elites, unless we get rid of crime and organized crime, we will never actually achieve democracy and market economy. So there's this implication that reform is conditional upon decriminalization of the economy, which later on actually led to this perpetual and constant restructuring and reformulating of policies since the 1990s and since 2001, 2004, and 2007 again, all these kind of different periods in which I have looked at. And the fight against organized crime became a perpetual battle against the bodies as such. It was presumed that kind of a democracy implies legality, so we can never have democracy unless we actually decriminalize the economy and decriminalize society. So which is a very, very complex argument, and whether that can ever be achieved is a completely different issue, and perhaps it cannot be achieved and cannot be measured, which puts the governments and the actions of the governments in a very difficult position whereby they are constantly pressured to kind of deliver on those goals, but also being unable to prove that they deliver or unable to show that there is any kind of result. So externally, I link the rise of organized crime to the EU pressure, obviously, and internally this kind of restructuring of the state and change of internal politics and change of around these new existential choices that are being made internally, as whether you're the criminals, the old elite or new elite, criminal or non-criminal. So this kind of opposition between the two, which kind of polarized society to a very big extent. And the third thing I look at is how was that achieved? What was actually done to fight organized crime? As you may find familiar, the kind of steps that have been taken, because they're not only in Bulgaria but also in other countries which have embarked on anti-crime agenda. These have taken four main steps. The first of all is prioritizing the fight against crime as a security issue. So this means that it's adopted through the security documents and they prioritized in Parliament and the governmental agendas, and it is addressed by kind of extraordinary measures which are usually linked to security politics. The second step is obviously adopting new legislation that is supposed to fight organized crime, which is very problematic because of problems with definitions, because of disconnecting crime from other forms of crime, whether organized crime, what is exactly organized crime, membership in a group, what kind of activities do organized crime entail, how is organized crime different from corporate crime, for example, and different kinds of organizational crimes. And the third step, is the institution building, which obviously part of the bigger agenda in 1990s politics and member state and state building, is the kind of reliance on this institutional building. So looking at the restructuring of the different agencies that are dealing with crime and different ministries. So the fight against crime is peculiar in that it affects actually all branches of the executive and legislative power, as well as the court system, the prosecution system, the police system, the army, and so on. And the fourth important thing is this centralization of those agencies, or attempt to centralize those agencies and link them to international politics, the international policy making and international fight against organized crime. So organized crime was not only prioritized, it was fight against crime was centralized and externalized, linked to international agenda. And the fourth thing that I looked at is what has been the result of all that in Bulgaria. The first thing, obviously, was the emergence of turf wars, wars between the institutions. So the police, even internally within the institution, there was obviously a fight between the departments, whether those departments that were actually created to fight organized crime clashed with the departments that were dealing with ordinary crime, and the departments of the police that are local clashed with the centralized, with the increasing centralization in the capital of the fight against organized crime. The fact that their power to take decisions on the local level was actually taken and centralized in the Ministry of Interior, and particularly this was done through the rhetoric of fighting organized crime that can actually affect all kinds of different crime, anti-crime agendas. And so internally within the police and within the structures, there was a lot of problems connected with this restructuring between the institutions as well. So the police started blaming the prosecution started blaming the courts, and the courts would blame the police. They would shift the blame from one to each other because of different reasons, particularly what I think is, first of all, institutional cultures and the way all of those institutions would actually take on crime from a different perspective. The police would be looking at suppressing crime and kind of removing the conditions in which crime thrives, particularly the financial conditions. Obviously, for prosecution, that would be completely different agendas. Collection of evidence, obviously, they would rely on the police to collect that evidence. If the evidence is not good enough, then the prosecution cannot proceed with its job. The court system, obviously, was relying on good prosecution, good case, to have to let criminal or defendants go. They will have to let criminals go if they don't have good evidence. And because of taking organized crime as a separate type of crime from ordinary crime, there was a clash between the different parts of the investigation. Because if it comes to a murder, how do you investigate a murder? You have people who investigate murder as such in the department, which is separate from organized crime department. So this coordination between elements of organized crime, whether it's smuggling, whether it's contract killing, whether it's financing, actually implies a lot of different departments within the institutions, which have started to duplicate their tasks. So they started doing all over the same kinds of investigations, and kind of you start to use up a lot of resources for this prioritization of the fight against crime. Basically, the result of this, this was exposed in the media, this kind of turf wars and conflicts between institutions, has led to the diminishing capacities of those institutions to actually achieve any of those results, and the further weakening of the trust in institutions, which is one of the important things in democracy. So I think we kind of go full circle. So starting from the fact that organized crime is weakening the state, going through all the steps in which were taken in Bulgaria, which I discuss in more detail in the paper, have actually led to a situation whereby those institutions are further weakened in the eyes of the public and further marginalized as, in terms of their capacity to deal with crime. So there was this kind of loss of authority of the state and loss of trust of the state. And one study in 2008 of Alpha Research in Bulgaria showed that the opinion of the public about the organized crime fight and their trust in the different institutions involved in that agenda actually has diminished since the 1997, and we're talking about something like 60% or over 60% of the Bulgarian population do not trust the police, they do not trust the prosecution service, and about 80% do not trust the parliament. The only institution, actually, a security institution that had kind of scored a little bit better was the army in that study. So I add a further element to that. So the way I explain all this actually is through a different spectrum. This is the social policy, which is what the title of the paper implies. I actually think that partly this prioritization of the fight against organized crime, this constant redressing of plans, change of legislation. We're talking about a number of laws that have been adopted and changed, and plans and strategies, and adoption of the European Union law in justice and home affairs, and the Schengen Accords, and so on and so forth. This constant movement and this constant change of legislation is actually an excuse for dealing with a lot of the real conditions, underlying conditions, causes of crime, which traditional criminology has been looking at throughout the years. It's partly this kind of prioritizing and limiting the view of crime over this idea of organized crime, which is probably about 5% of crime and kind of crime rates in the country, has opened up the possibility to not deal, kind of avoid responsibility for a lot of other issues and kind of social policy where the state has actually removed its role from. So I think that partly the weakening of the state is contributed from the fact that actually the state has weakened itself as well. It has weakened itself by limiting its role to smaller and smaller areas which it claims to have a capacity to deal with and prioritize. So crime in the area of crime and crime fighting has been organized crime rather than social inequalities or social policies which create the conditions of that crime. Because if you look at those kinds of crimes that I mentioned at the beginning, the trafficking in drugs, women, illegal migrants, and weapons, and so on, they are conditioned on the availability of criminal labor at the bottom, and the fact that there are people who are prepared to actually do those kinds of crimes, and people who have no alternative, particularly in women trafficking. So by not dealing with these underlying conditions and prioritizing the organized crime as a security issue rather than a social issue, and kind of creating this idea of the big enemy that is the criminal and the organized criminal, the state has actually removed its responsibility from kind of areas that it can have a real impact and kind of contribute to its legitimacy and the population's trust in the institutions and their capacity to deliver. So this is, as a whole, what I've been looking at in my research, and it's very much a research in progress. So there's further clarifications to those to the arguments I'm presenting, which I will continue to work on. But I will very much welcome any comments or any questions from you as well at the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much to the presenters and to the audience for the patience, because we run a bit late. Just to wrap up, as we heard in this panel, the security challenges in the Balkans today could be they kind of derive from one side on the lack of cohesion, trust and integration among people, and from the other side of the weakness of states, which provides grounds for emergence of the non-state actors that could drive really more serious security challenges in the current environment. So we are very, yes, as we said, we are running late. So if you have any questions, we will try to keep this session a bit shorter, the question and answer session. So if there is anybody who is willing to pose a question to any of the participants, please do. Yes, please.
My name is Biljana Đorđević, and I have two questions. One is for Mr. Marius Kalu. The question is, what is the period where you were assessing Kosovo statehood as weak? Because from your presentation, I understood that you were implying that your assessment starts after the conflict. I mean, you were mentioning United Nations mission in Kosovo and standards before status, and that's, for me, it's interesting because statehood of Kosovo is contested even today, but we could talk about statehood after 2008. But before that, we don't have all the elements. Actually, it's very difficult to have to claim that we have any elements of statehood. We don't have defined territory and population, capacity to enter international relations, and authority. Because we all know that at that time, legally, we had suspended sovereignty of Yugoslavia over the territory of Kosovo, and nobody was actually claiming statehood. So I'm just curious whether your question would be self-defeating in the period before 2008. And the question for Ms. Bačević is about multiculturalism. How did you define it when you were asking questions since many participants said that they feel that multiculturalism is imposed in south of Serbia. And a comment which I think in a way supports your final conclusions, just in relation to the answers of participants, that they felt that there was no social integration even in the communist Yugoslavia. And I agree, but I feel that it's a completely different type of social non-integration in comparison to what is happening today. Because if we don't assess just subjective feelings of participants, there were more objective evidence like inter-ethnic marriages that are currently, I dare to say, non-existent, and that they were present before the conflict, than language skills, which I find really important in multicultural society, in not segregated multicultural society, which is something I think we should never endorse, and what we have on the ground today. So before the conflict, and especially in the communist period, there were many Serbs as majority who spoke Albanian and were proficient in Albanian, and vice versa, which is today not the case. And so Serbs do not learn Albanian at all, and more Albanians do not learn Serbian. So when I go home there, I sometimes speak in English, which I find really bizarre. Thank you.
Yes, we can take a few questions and then to answer all of them. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. I have two questions as well. One for Marius. Marius getting all this attention. But you talked about the impact of legacies of the past in your sort of conceptual framework. So what I'm interested in is how have you thought about actually, how are you going to qualify, how are you going to operationalize this? Because, we all talk about the impact of legacies, but how exactly are you going to sort of take it from the ground and study it and qualify it and be able to sort of put a tangible little framework on it? And the second question is for Mr. Hadjianov. I really like your presentation. We rarely get the chance to talk to people who actually do security and study security, unlike most of us who only study security. But what I would like to know is sort of your comment, your personal evaluation of how big a threat do terrorist attacks over critical infrastructure pose, as opposed to other security challenges that the Western Balkans and in particular Macedonia faces. Why I'm asking is this perhaps because of our lack of knowledge of critical infrastructure in our country or in the region, but my impression is that there's very little critical infrastructure in Macedonia to be defended. Like you talked about this pipeline, but that pipeline is not built, really. So, I mean, there's very little out there. There's perhaps like one thermal electrical plant near Bitola, which is quite old and obsolete. So, I mean, what exactly is it that, if Macedonia came up with this critical infrastructure strategy, would be protected, and how big of a threat in general this is, as opposed to the other threats? Thank you.
One more question was there. Else who would like to pose a question? No? Okay. Yeah, there was somebody, but is there anybody? No. Okay. Yes, please, if you have a question, please.
Yes. So, Radu Kurchumaru, Heidelberg University, Germany. First of all, thank you very much for your quite thought-provoking presentations. And I do have a couple of comments and questions, but I will keep it short. First to Jana. Indeterminacy of status due to what? Presence of IOs or development and so on and so forth. Then I do have a problem. I find your concept of imposed multiculturalism a little bit problematic because multiculturalism, we do have different ethnicities over there, so it's a given, it's not imposed. You could You could use imposed power sharing, imposed consociational arrangements, but not multiculturalism, in my opinion. Then low levels of trust towards the state. Would you elaborate on the state as the question to Marius as well? So distrust state, because state is as government, state as judicial courts, state as military, police. So could you elaborate on this as well? The state, what does it mean? Yes, so you've mentioned distrust in state institutions. Then you mentioned Johann Galtungs. Anecdotally speaking, he would have named the forum as Belgrade Peace Forum and not Security, because he does have a problem with security. But hopefully in a couple of decades we'll have a peace forum as well. So, and you are mentioning about negative and positive peace. So in your opinion, what kind of peace is in the region you analyze? And yeah, we could discuss and continue discussing your presentation also afterwards. Marius, I very much liked your innovative idea and approach of combining legacies of the past and liberal institutions, so a kind of hybridization of political system. What would you say, in your opinion, is weak but not failing? That I found it quite interesting. Not failing as what? What is the perspective, actually? Would it then emerge as a strong state? Would it stay or keep on failing, and so on and so forth? So, in your opinion. And to Metodi Hajliev, very fascinating. I'll just subscribe to previous comments to hear practitioner and theoretician as well. So, a comment to your private security firms are neglected. So what do you mean by that? So would they then receive more support from the state? Should they be replaced by state special forces who are, in terms of allegiance and legitimacy, would give a state of assurance to the people and firms and state in fighting the terrorism? But thank you very much to all of them. And I do have a couple of questions for you, but I'll just stop here and we'll continue in the break. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your questions. So who would like to answer first? And please keep your answers extremely short.
Okay, I'll try to be short. The first question, I guess the best way to explain is going back to the division between domestic and legal sovereignty. So from this perspective, before 2008, it wasn't, international legal sovereignty was not relevant. So the whole focus of my thesis is on ways of developing domestic sovereignty, thus concrete capacity to provide political goods and provide security, institution building, rule of law, all this that were going on before 2008. And this is still relevant because we still have a contested statehood and Kosovo is not recognized. So this is an ongoing problem. That's why my solely focus is on this particular aspect of sovereignty, domestic sovereignty. The second question about the legacy of the past and finding empirical ground. Well, it's good you asked me because I'm planning to do my field work in the north of Kosovo, and I'm planning to do in the area of judiciary. And I can thus look at the problems that are there and how the judiciary system is not functioning, or to what extent it is functioning. Look at what are the causes, and part of these causes can be the way sub-state formations can sustain this problem of the judiciary. And an example is how criminal networks have developed in a post-communist and post-conflict context, and are actually inter-ethnic criminal networks, so that go beyond ethnicity. And this could be a concrete example of the legacy of the past. And I guess this is also related to what is the state? This is what I'm going to be looking at, the judiciary. And this is a basic citizen's right. And it's also, the main mission for the EU in Kosovo is developing the rule of law and developing a sustainable judiciary system. And looking at the future, I think it will mainly depend on the international help, on the international donors, and how they're going to deal with these problems, and with whether they're going to start considering more seriously these problems of a dual legacy of the past, will actually reinforce what is a per se democratic legal authority for sustainable domestic sovereignty. Thank you.
Jana, please.
I'll also try to be as brief as possible. Thanks everybody for the questions. They're very useful given that those are exactly the points that I plan to elaborate on, but I was afraid that I won't have enough time in the presentation. So thank you for giving me some extra time. I will group the questions on multiculturalism together. How did we define multiculturalism? Well, we didn't. Very intentionally we didn't. This is a common strategy when doing non-elite interviews. Because if you interview the so-called ordinary people, and I, again, excuse the use of this not entirely intelligent expression, but there is no better one at hand, it's important not to impose terms. So multiculturalism, as well as imposed multiculturalism, were concepts that were brought on by the participants in the interviews themselves without any external prompting from our side, at least in the beginning. However, on that note, I will tend to disagree that multiculturalism is a fact of life. Multiculturalism is a form of identity politics, and this is again the reason why it's very important how participants perceive it, and especially if they perceive it as externally imposed. On the note of real integration or real multiculturalism existing prior to the conflict, one of the things that we did encounter is a lot of glorification of the good old, the golden era of the communism when everything was fine, etc., etc., etc. So more or less the description of the interethnic relations in the same terms that you had used. That's again, it's a form of narrative, and beyond that, we did see that there were some limits to integration that were mostly defined in cultural terms, or rather in terms of cultural differences, which then again goes back to the question of whether multiculturalism is a fact of life or actually a form of regime. When it comes to the question of what is the state, well, frankly, I have no idea. I think a lot of scholars in the past hundreds or even thousands of years, if we count back to Aristotle and Plato, have tried to answer that question, and with somewhat questionable success. But when the participants in our study refer to the state, it's mostly it's a shorthand for the central government in Belgrade. And in terms of negative versus positive piece, I would say that this particular region, Preševo and Bujanovac, falls more within the negative sort, but of course with really, really important regional, local, ethnic, social, etc., etc. variations. And on the note of replacing security with peace, well, I agree with you, but that's, I'm afraid, a point for the organizers. So yeah, that's all, and thank you again for the questions. It was very useful.
Thank you, Jan.
Okay, I think that your question is quite good, and I like the challenge that you gave with the question, because that's my point. One of the reasons that 9/11 happened actually is due to the failure of imagination that they have. How can that happen? And I will come later to the electrical power plant that you mentioned. However, Macedonia does have an OHIS factory, which risk analysis says that in first 5 hours, half of the country will be actually contaminated. And after that, once when that contamination from the chemistry reach the River Vardar, it goes to the Aegean Sea, and then will also contaminate Greece. Now, the electrical power plant, I came up with the idea how that old power plant, though it's not the only one in the Macedonia right now, but the only one that you mentioned is crucial. It is because 90% of the actually government officials and security officials run to the electricity. So once when that happens, let's say electrical power plant is going down, the whole integrated border security management is connected to that area. So it's sufficient enough, they will have enough time to, once when the authorities consider, as you can see now, there is a release of the Discovery Channel about what happened in 9/11. They didn't know whether this is an exercise or something bad has happened. So it's quite good enough time to put a virus that can collect all data for all of the integrated system. And remember, this is not only Macedonian data, but those are data that, because it's an integrated border security system that collects security data for EU, NATO, and Interpol. Because once when that system was introduced, they share all data. Another problem with this is, let's say, we don't consider just critical infrastructure, just what can kill us immediately. What about cyber attacks? Let's say most of the cell companies, private cell companies now are owned by the private corporates. The government don't provide security for them. The security comes from the private corporate security, and that actually links to the question of the gentleman behind. And one attack, cyber attack on those companies will actually shut that half of the official in Macedonia in the first half hour. Why? Because in many countries around the world, and even in Western Balkans, many officials actually use cell phones, commercial cell phones to communicate. Once when that is dead, imagine how small period of time they can to smuggle things and move from Macedonia to Bulgaria, let's say, where where they don't have just power plant, but they have a nuclear plant, and it's very close. And then there is a Krško, also very close, because you cannot, and that was actually make the critical infrastructure. And now I will get back to the second question. I totally don't think that special forces should go out and provide. Actually, that's the sensitivity with the critical infrastructure protection. On one hand, which would you choose? You will choose liberty, freedom, or you will choose security. So you have to find the balance. This is why I suggested that those private corporate security. I mean, if you go into I've contacted many Western Balkans authorities about this, and I've discussed, and all of them would say, like in Macedonia, they would say, yes, they have specific certificates, kind of, okay. And then there is a question, when was the last time that they practiced an exercise on this? When was the last time that they practiced joint exercise with other authorities, with, let's say, police? Okay, what is the level? Who gives the certificate? What is the level of training that they received? What was the last time that they have checked this? Are they aware of this type of terrorist attacks? Or because they won't attack military facilities, police. They know that those are hard targets. They will attack always soft targets. And I will wrap up, and I will be available if you want. We can discuss further on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions, for the answers, and this is the end of this first panel. So now we'll have a coffee break. Thank you.